Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another NLP Insider live show, and thank you so much for joining us. We will be here live every other week for 15 minutes to talk about everything NLP with industry leaders. My name is David Talby, and I'm the CTO of John Snow Labs. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Zach Childers, Manager of NLP and Machine Learning at Press Ganey. Zach has worked in NLP in healthcare for over 5 years at Narrative DX and continuing through the acquisition by Press Ganey. Zach has been focusing on NLP to understand the patient's voice during COVID-19 and how the same techniques can be used to understand unhappy patients or improve overall patient experiences. Zach will also be speaking at the upcoming Healthcare NLP Summit on April 5th and 6th. Zach, welcome. I'm very glad to have you here today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Zach, can you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. So, so like you said, I work. I head the group of NLP and Machine Learning at Press Ganey. We're solely healthcare focused. We look at comments from a variety of parts of healthcare, with the core being the patient experience. So these would be comments that a patient would leave after some hospital visit or with some other provider. And we also look at employee workforce comments. So, within the healthcare setting, we work in member experience. So the insurance customers and their experience with that side of healthcare. And we also do some clinical NLP in safety. And so we cover basically every part of the healthcare ecosystem.
Interesting. So can you tell us a bit about your own background and how you got into healthcare?
Yeah. So, well, I really got into healthcare by accident. I studied computational linguistics and natural language processing at the University of Texas. But I was also just really interested in theoretical linguistics, and I still am. My dissertation, in fact, was about the expression of sentiment in a certain class of English verbs, and it was not very applied stuff, right? But one day, as I was getting close to graduating, I got an email from a computational linguistics professor about a job opportunity with a relatively new startup called Narrative DX, and they were looking for someone with essentially exactly my background, and healthcare experience for them was just kind of a nice to have. Which was nice for me because I didn't have any at all, right? And I was not very enthusiastic about a career in academics at the time, and I was looking for opportunities in artificial intelligence, and they also happened to be located in Austin, which was convenient for me. And in fact, I talked to them and got a job offer from Narrative DX on the day that I defended my dissertation at UT. So I transitioned right away from academic linguistics to healthcare NLP. And I knew that they had, were a brilliant startup from what I'd seen, but I only really discovered how interesting and rewarding it can be to, apply NLP in the healthcare setting in the years that followed as I worked with them. And then joining Press Ganey with their wealth of data and influence on the healthcare experience nationally, has really only intensified that feeling.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think we are fairly similar in how we got into healthcare. I think
that accidentally is not the worst way to get into something.
Precisely. Yes. Yeah. So you've been working on using NLP to understand patient sentiments, most recently for COVID-19 patients. Can you introduce us to some examples of practical use cases?
So in the early days of the pandemic, people were pretty quickly aware that every aspect of the healthcare experience, both for patients and providers, was really strained. Everyone could see that the patients were increasingly unhappy, but it wasn't really clear, at least initially, what the source of that was, whether it was just general stress of pre-vaccine COVID or hospital overcrowding, or whether interactions with providers was deteriorating. And that wouldn't be entirely, implausible, of course, because healthcare workers were and still are, in a lot of cases, hit unbelievably hard by the pandemic. So what we wanted to do was to look explicitly at comments that were about COVID-19, compare them to non-COVID comments, and also to identify trends in the COVID comments, really from February to April of 2020. So these were the very early days in the pandemic, right? Yeah. And what we found was that, not terribly surprisingly, COVID comments were more frequently negative than non-COVID comments. But interestingly, they weren't uniformly negative about every aspect of the experience. So there were a lot of concerns about tests and treatments, of course, and a lot of sort of anxiety around cleanliness. But when talking about people, the sentiment was very different. In fact, comments about providers and staff were actually increasingly positive as the pandemic intensified. And these positive insights clustered around issues related to courtesy and respect. So like kindness, empathy, that sort of thing. And around the skill of the providers, especially their professionalism. And that was a really important message to sort of get out and amplify at the time, especially as providers were experiencing increasing stress and burnout and just general demoralization, right? So that look into the early days of the pandemic was only really possible with NLP. People were talking about COVID, right? Even if institutions weren't, yet systematically asking about it. So traditional surveying really needed a boost. And then more recent comment analytics have enabled us to handle emergent issues, vaccines, telemedicine, that sort of thing, and adjust to the effect of those things on thematic categorization and sentiment. So pre-pandemic, a comment like, I wasn't allowed to have visitors might be a negative comment, right? While at the height of COVID, it was just a statement of fact based on the new reality. So they may be responding to a question about visitors saying, well, I wasn't allowed to have visitors. And there are a lot of examples like that.
Interesting. In how many human languages are you operating?
We translate some, but the analysis is solely English currently.
Okay. On to the next thing. You talk at the upcoming Healthcare NLP Summit is about the entropy and sentiment, the Anachronic Principle in patient experience data, which sounds super interesting. So can you tell us a bit more about what this principle is and how it applies to improving patient experience?
Yeah. So the principle is inspired by the first line of the novel Anachronic, which is by Tolstoy, old novel, and it's usually translated as something like, all happy families are alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, right? Yep. So one thing that we've noticed for a long time in patient experience comments is that positive comments in general, they tend to be less specific, right? And they're kind of uniform across their content, and more than negative comments, right? So you'd see things like everything was great, but then the doctor didn't clearly explain my diagnosis. So more specific in the negative domain and kind of like higher level, less granular in the positive. So the Anachronic Principle, which is that essentially, it's borrowed from that line that, things can go wrong in a lot of different ways, but things are successful in pretty similar ways. And in particular, oftentimes just by avoiding all the different ways that things can go wrong. So that lens is really a nice way to view this difference that we were seeing in negative and positive comments. And there's kind of an interesting NLP corollary to the Anachronic Principle, which is that positive comments tend to be linguistically more uniform to one another, while negative comments are more varied, right? Negative comments also happen to be less common in most natural patient experience data. So you have these less frequent, but also less uniform comments, and that presents a comparatively greater machine learning problem, right?
So in what way are they less uniform? What kind of variance are you seeing linguistically?
Lexically, for one, right? So like if they're talking about a bunch of a large number of different categories, they tend to use different words in the way that they discuss it. But since oftentimes they're more complex in general, syntactically they become a lot more complex, right? So if just in the example I gave, everything was great. That's a simple, noun phrase, verb phrase, copula thing. Yeah. But the doctor didn't explain. What was the example I said? I think something like the doctor didn't clearly explain my diagnosis. There's a lot more going on there syntactically, right? And so, that creates a machine learning problem where you have this class of comments that are less common and more varied and complex, right? So in fact, we found that most of the source of our sentiment errors come from trying to accurately identify negative sentiment, right? Positive comments are actually comparatively easier. We get those right a lot more than we get negative sentiments right. So given certain model or data limitations, it's often times necessary to intervene on the model in order to boost performance on negative sentiment comments. So to target relatively low frequency but reliable influences on sentiment. And that's actually a big part of the upcoming talk at the Healthcare Summit that I'm going to be giving.
Very interesting. I look forward to hearing it.
Thank you. Yeah. Looking forward to hearing it.
So other than this, where else do you see further potential for NLP to make patients feel better and happier?
Well, so it's very interesting. So, natural language is, of course, just infused with emotional signals, right? And that's especially true when the patient is, expressly attempting to deliver a message about how they felt about some experience. So, the best way to improve the patient experience is really just to listen to the patient's own description of what went right and what went wrong in some encounter. It's simple, right? But it's also very powerful, right? NLP makes listening to that patient's voice possible at a very large scale, which then allows you to separate the signal from the noise, identify trends, and intervene when necessary, right? Crucially, though, it also allows for the discovery of emergent or idiosyncratic issues, right, which are likely to be missed by traditional surveying. And then, this rapidly, so for example, COVID, right? So, that's one good example. And then things related to COVID, right? So like the emergence of vaccines, the emergence of, antivirals, these will emerge in the language before we can actually ask about them, right? In a traditional survey setting. And there are a lot of examples like that, but COVID, I think, is probably the most salient over the last several years. And then, of course, there's these rapid advancements in NLP, especially in areas like sentiment, inference, summarization, and these are usually aided by transformer-based models, which have been a boon to the field. All of this only just makes it like a more powerful tool for improving and scaling the task of just listening to what the patient has to say, which is what we're trying to do.
Interesting. Thank you, Zach. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge. Everyone, be sure to catch Zach's session, as well as over 30 additional amazing talks from industry leaders focused on NLP best practices, real-world case studies, and challenges in practice at the upcoming Healthcare NLP Summit on April 5th and April 6th. We will drop a link in the chat right here so you can register today. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And I again greatly enjoyed our chat and very much looking forward to your summit talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.